I want to thank Dr. Wilhite for his presentation, because it really sets the stage and grounds many of the things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try to bring this to a practical level for us in the facilities management business and for us who are on university campuses in general. And I have a number of things that I'm going to try to weave in and out of this presentation, and in doing so I was trying to find a common theme in which to organize around, and I came to this risk and responsibilities, especially as it relates to the facilities management profession. So the things that I'll be talking about, we'll be addressing the risk that we've actually experienced with a flood event on a campus, as well as our responsibility for managing that risk and our responsibility for being part of the solution. This notion of risk is something that been talking more and more about in our profession. In fact, I co-authored an article with a colleague, Jerry King, that was recognized as the best article in Apple's Facilities Manager magazine last year. And I'm not going to get into it very deeply, but what it basically said is, what's the value proposition that we provide as facilities managers? And this all came out of the context that we were told to explain what we do for incoming new board members. And rather than say that we provide utility services, we clean, we take care of grounds, we build things, we provide critical utilities, that's what we do. Why we do it, why it's important is what we went to with this value proposition article. And the thing that surprised us as we really try to categorize everything we did is this notion of managing risk. That's not a normal thing that flows from our mouth about what we do. But the importance of what we do is, and we don't probably even realize, we manage risk for our institutions all the time. The risk of keeping a building viable and operational, the risk of avoiding unnecessary costs for business interruptions, and avoiding risk from natural disasters and other events. So I think increasingly we need to think of ourselves in terms of our value propositions, quit talking about deferred maintenance, and talk about our role in extending the life of an asset. And so on. So just point of me bringing this up is it ties into this notion that I'm hearing more and more in our circles about our role in managing institutional risk, or the part that we're responsible for. So with that, I want to take us back to April 22nd, 2008. Does that date ring a bell with anybody? That was Earth Day in 2008. All was good. It was springtime, beautiful campus, things were blooming. And we were enjoying a good time. Our art building West was just opened up, receiving international acclaim for Stephen Hull design, for a building that actually works in the facilities world. That allowed us to undergo a renovation of our historic art building, which is where Grant Wood did his work on the University of Iowa campus. And these buildings are all I'm going to come back and show you these buildings in a different state in a minute. But we just opened up a new renovation, a ground floor renovation of our student union, a new bookstore, state-of-the-art food services, and so on. And we're being recognized nationally for our work on green power, which I'll talk about later on. But on April 22nd, our president launched a sustainability initiative that included many facets of what we were going to do. One of them was the creation of the Office of Sustainability on our campus. And we were charged in facilities management with creating this office, defining its charter, and administratively responsible for it. And this was at a time when many other universities were starting up similar offices. And some universities went with an office that was academically or research-oriented. Some went with an operational-oriented office, and typically in a facilities management organization. At our institution, we wanted one office doing all of that. So it was a rather comprehensive charge that the office was given. It was chartered with no growth. We were looking at other models around the country. We saw some institutions that had as many as 20 individuals serving in their Office of Sustainability. Our model was to promote the creation locally of sustainable practices and local sustainability efforts. We were to facilitate that, not do it for the offices. So out of the gate, we said no growth, but we also out of the gate funded 3 positions. So we didn't start incremental. We said for this office to really do its charter, it needs a director, a communications manager, and a sustainability coordinator. Those 3 positions were funded, and they existed. They have not grown. since. But we were, part of why we were charged with this, the facilities management had a reputation, a successful reputation based on many things we were doing operationally, with green power and energy conservation in particular. So before the first person could be hired, 40 days later, we were dealing with this. These are photos from early June of 2008 in the state of Iowa. Cedar Rapids is up in the upper left-hand corner. I love the shot with the pigs. How can you not? Yeah, this was our flood of 2008. Now, I'm going to tell you something that none of you would guess. This was FEMA's 5th largest natural disaster in its history at that time. It's been surpassed, but this is where we sat back in 2008 behind Katrina, Northridge earthquake, and Hurricane Ike. This is the magnitude of what the state of Iowa was dealing. This is measured by FEMA's declaration and costs behind that. A lot of people don't realize it. It was widespread, wasn't concentrated, took a long time, a summer of damage and destruction. It wasn't that one event that comes in and hammers a city like Katrina. But you can see where it lies. If you take Katrina and you lump them together, both Louisiana and Mississippi was the 4th most impactful natural disaster in the nation's history. I think Superstorm Sandy and perhaps another event or two might have pushed us down a bit, but it was large in its magnitude. What's also interesting is that the University of Iowa was about half of that declaration itself. A mile or so stretch of the university, because of the intensity and the expense of what we have being flooded, ran those numbers up dramatically. This is FEMA's largest facility loss. This is more expensive than anything destroyed by Katrina. This is our Performing Arts Center, our music department, and Clap Recital Hall. This is a total loss. It's costing us $325 million to replace. A huge single loss. And FEMA operates on a building-by-building loss basis, which is a whole nother story. I could talk an hour about the challenges with FEMA, trying to understand the central plant and how all this ties together. But it actually outscaled FEMA's normal operation, dealing with smaller businesses, homeowners, and all that. So it was the largest single loss in their history. 22 major buildings were shut down during this flood. 1/6 of our campus was closed. 1/4 of our classroom capacity lost. 1/5 of our residence hall beds were offline, that's just from this one hall right here. Our total steam and power generation completely underwater, closed in June, not opened until almost November. Going into an Iowa winter, that's scary. One of the nation's top 25 hospitals was crippled because it did not have the reliability of that steam plant. And certainly during the event was crippled. And the estimated impact today adds up to almost $1 billion on our campus. When you look at the flood response, the cleanup, the temporary facilities, and the rebuilding effort, we're looking at $1 billion worth of damage on our campus. As importantly, I should never put anything ahead of money, but it put us into a different mode for 7 years now. We're still not back on our feet completely. Yes, sir. About half of it is going to come from FEMA, and the rest has been institutional monies that we've had to come up with. So it's put what would normally be our institutional progress and our strategic planning on hold as we diverted our funds. The state came up with the money, the institutions come up with money. We're getting some great new facilities out of it, but it wasn't necessarily the facilities we would have chose to invest in at this time. So why did it happen? There's two things that I like to talk about. It's the perfect storm and the final storm, both climate-related, weather-related. The perfect storm, we were coming off a record snowfall for that winter of 7 and 8. And that's not so bad, except it didn't melt. It didn't melt until the spring. And you can see that spike right there in the month of late March. This is the Coralville Reservoir. We're downriver from Corps of Engineers Dam. That's the normal pool elevation throughout the winter. And then over a 2-week period, everything was melting in the river basin coming down. Before it could be drawn back down, the rains came. The spring rains came and just started dumping and dumping and dumping into the watershed. And so we saw the spike, a little bit of drawdown, and then boom. This is when things got really interesting in June. This is a profile of the dam itself, and this is where the spillway is at 712. The normal pool elevation is down here, and for 11, 12, 13 days, we were flowing over the spillway, uncontrolled discharge, as shown right there over the spillway from our reservoir. A 5 foot of water at its peak coming over that as well as the under dam discharge being full open. But you know, this is only part of the story, and I'm going to hit you on 5 lessons I'm going to share 5 lessons that we learned through all this. I have 14, but I only have time for 5 today. This is really a tale of 2 cities and 2 rivers. We have the Cedar River and the Iowa River flowing through Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, respectively. And this is a picture of Cedar Rapids. And unlike anything we saw before, this one was affecting a greater community around us. And it was impacting us in our effort to respond to it because it was so regional, so impactful. And we're seeing this more and more with a lot of these types of disasters. They're of a scale that your plans, institutional plans, may not work because of what's going on around in the greater community. So the first lesson is to broaden the context for emergency planning. It was interesting, before the 2008 flood, when we thought about pandemic flu planning, we thought of it in the context of what we need as a university. We need gloves, and we need to have a plan to send students home or keep them or whatever. Since then, we're saying we can't count on anything. We can't count on being able to get the supply chain. We can't count on the coal truck driver not having the flu and not delivering the fuel to the university, the power of the hospital that's going to respond to the state. So you have to go way out there and say, what can happen in a greater context, like a flu? What critical positions could you be missing? This is what we learned. So we're dealing with all kind of disasters that seem to be getting, some of them getting more intensified and more widespread. So I'll just expand the thinking beyond flood. Well, the things I talk about today are flood-based, but they can be, those principles can be expanded to a larger context. So outside the planning principles is that we never realized that we would be in such competition with everyone over pumps, sandbags, sand, shovels, and so on. Generators, because everybody in the state was dealing with this. When sandbags were found, everybody wanted to grab them. When we got sandbags, our neighbors, residential neighbors, wanted to borrow some. And it's really an awkward situation where you got to take care of yourself first. But we really had to wait in line for some of this critical equipment that we assumed would be there when we needed it. We also assumed that everybody would be there. All hands on deck. We have a flood. Everybody get in there and help. Well, not everybody could get in there. Not everybody could get to the campus. Not everybody could get away from their home. They were dealing with the personal problems with the same disaster. So you can't assume in your planning that you're going to have all this personnel that you think you're going to have, because people are going to be affected personally by this disaster as well. Here, this was outside the planning principles as well. This is Interstate 80. This is the Cedar River topping Interstate 80 between Iowa City and the Quad Cities. Let me get sure. Yeah, Iowa City's here, and this is the Quad Cities, and the Cedar River cut that off. So this became a 4-hour detour for critical supplies to get to Iowa City. We were bringing in a temporary boiler, temporary chillers, generators, and all that, to the point where the National Guard was ready to helicopter that equipment in because of this closure. So that's bad enough. But 380, which connects Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, also went underwater. So we had 2 major interstates feeding Iowa City that were succumbed. Guess how many employees are on the other side of that river? Guess whose daughter was on the other side of that river? It's, you know, again, I'm dealing with this institutional response, and I have a child who is stuck on the wrong side of that river. That's her own fault, but nonetheless, she's stuck there. And that she went to a concert in the Quad Cities the night before this thing closed. But anyhow, that's another story. Our campus is bifurcated by the Iowa River, and we have 3 bridges. Again, outside our planning principles, we didn't realize that we wouldn't have 2 of them. We could not use these bridges. The approaches were underwater. Not only that, I'll just add, we were doing all this flood response downriver from this bridge, and there was a water differential up against the beam of that bridge. And we were told if we were to lose that bridge, we would see a wave of water come down. So in addition to everything else we had to worry about a bridge failure that could put people at risk. None of this was in our planning because of the scale of what we were dealing with. This is interesting, and especially as we're talking about the intensity of heat. This is the National Guard protecting a major substation that feeds our East Campus. And it was under risk of going under. Had it gone under, we would have lost our power supply to half of our campus. Again, we never thought about that. But this was of a magnitude that that risk had never reached that point, but it was very close. So that just brings me to step outside the University of Iowa for a minute. When we talk about the national grid, electric grid, power grid, this is something that I've spoke about at almost every presentation I've given on this, because we're all at risk of power grid failure. But none of us are really planning for that. Are we ready for a 6-hour outage like the University of Maryland? This is University of Maryland a few months ago, evacuating a building when they lost power to their campus. But with more and more intense days, more and more 100-degree days, we're putting a lot of stress on a very fragile infrastructure that hasn't been keeping pace, hasn't been renewed, isn't robust enough at normal times, let alone abnormal times. So we have to start with loss of power scenario, and for 6 hours, for 6 days, for 6 weeks, and think about that. Here's another thing that opened my eyes. I was at a national presentation. There are a lot of familiar faces in the room, and I know I spoke to some of you about when I presented in Denver for APA in 13, I think it was. A colleague of mine from Missouri Southern State University was there. This is Joplin. This is the Joplin tornado. And what you're seeing is the hospital, local hospital there. Missouri Southern was the only institution not hit by this F5 tornado. They became the triage center. They became the emergency response center. They became the place where the Red Cross set up, where everything was staged out of. They took their health sciences building and converted it to a hospital on the fly. They had a nursing program there, and they had the facilities to treat people who were injured. How many of us are ready to step into that role, where we're the ones not affected, but everyone around us is looking to us? And higher education institutions are one of the first that a community would go to. We need to be thinking about this greater context, just not ourselves. This is a 2006 tornado that went through Iowa City. That's a sorority house that was impacted, a neighborhood. Again, my daughter lived in this neighborhood. I was the first administrator at the university to get the call because she was there and called me in a panic, and I was the first to arrive there from the university. And it was completely dark for 2 blocks, and realized we have a refugee problem. That was hopefully nobody was hurt, and nobody was killed during this or seriously hurt during this tornado. But are we ready for that kind of disaster? The tornado doesn't hit our university, but would affect our student population to the point where we need to understand how we're going to deal with a refugee problem, with loss of life, with other things that affect the folks that we're entrusted to take care of. So again, my point is to try to expand the thinking on this, that greater context. The one thing that we didn't lose was our water supply. We have our own water plant at the University of Iowa, so the city has their plant. They're both on the Iowa River. The Iowa City plant was partially shut down because of the high water. And that little thing right there was the only thing between losing 1/6 of the campus and losing 100% of the campus. Had we lost that pump station, we would have brought down the hospital, we would have brought down the academic research, we would have brought down everything at the university because we were not interconnected with the city at the level that we could to keep us sustained operations, nor was the city in a position to provide the water that we would have needed anyhow. So, we were lucky in a sense, but hanging by a thread. So how prepared were we? Well, we were really prepared for another flood of '93. This was our 100-year flood. My predecessor had one major event that he had to respond to in his 40 years of service. This is it. I've had 3 since '08. I had the '08 flood, and I had 2 since then that weren't quite to the '08 level, but had a full-out implementation of our flood response. So let's talk briefly what a 100-year flood. This will really ground things. Is a statistical determinations on the chance of flooding. Really, a 100-year flood is a 1 in 100 chance of occurring at that level in a given year. And you have a 1 in 99, you have a 1 in 98, and you have a 1 in 97, and so on. A 500-year would be 1 in 500 chance. Our permitting usually says that we will build 1 foot above that 100-year risk, or that 1% risk. Actually, when we built the Coralville Dam on our campus, it lowered that building elevation because it mitigated or lowered the risk. And so what was interesting in the '08 flood, everything that was built after '58 was flooded on the main floor. Everything built before '58 didn't have main floor flooding on our campus. So we're really, that dam didn't really, it's helped us, but you know, we wish we hadn't reset the built elevation. Here's the main thing though, all these statistical flood elevations are out of date. They're decades old. I learned the term stationarity as I was preparing for this, and we don't have that. What we really have now is that the odds of this flood elevation happening is getting higher and higher. A 500-year flood is really an 80-year flood according to our Iowa Flood Center. 100 years, a 25-year, a 10 years, a 2-year. That's how much has changed since these determinations were made 50, 60 years ago. And again, plotting that over time, there is that third bullet, 120-year plot. It reinforces what Professor Wilhite was talking about. That has steadily climbed. So if you chart those peak events, they're getting higher, higher, and principally from 2 things: changes in climate and changes in the built environment. We're also seeing the rain get more and more severe on the April, May, June shoulder and the September, October shoulder, and less so in the middle of the summer. So the events that we're having are more concentrated, more intense, like we saw in May and June during our flood event. And so definitely things are shifting on us as we look at this from an engineering perspective. So basically, this flood outscaled anything that we have ever dealt with before. We were prepared for a 100-year flood. We got a 500. So really, this brings me to the second lesson: plan for your next disaster, not your last one. We had the perfect plan for a 93 flood event. But we didn't stop at a 93 flood. The one good thing that the Flood Emergency Response Plan put into, and by the way, it took us 13 years after 93 to get on the stick and do this. But thank God we did it, because at least it put in processes, relationships, ways of reacting to this flood event that served us well. But it was too narrow in its vision. And for instance, this is a plan. I know it's hard to read, but this is just a map that shows where we build sandbag barriers. And the highest sandbag barrier we have to put in is 2 feet high. This is outside our student union, 2-foot high wall. We're all set for the 100-year flood. In fact, it was very successful in beating back the 100-year flood. So successful that I put in for an award for it with APA's Innovative and Effective Awards program to demonstrate that it actually worked for a 100-year flood. Well, they saw through that. You guys were damaged $1 billion. We're not going to give you an award for that, but the point is, you know, what good is a successful emergency response plan when it's not geared or scaled to the emergency that you're dealing with? What's interesting, as this flood risk mounted on us, and it mounted daily. I mean, every day, every morning, we would get together and be told what to expect in river flow, which translated into elevation and protection. For every sandbag foot you go up, you have to go 3 wide. If you have a 3-foot sandbag wall, you have to have 9 feet of base. And by the time you get to 9 feet tall, which we did, you should need a 27 sandbag base. That's a credible number of sandbags. So what we had to do is actually underneath what you see there is a Jersey barrier. So at some point the projections say, we're not going to be able to build a sandbag wall high enough. Let's get a Jersey barrier in place and wrap it with sandbags, which is we did. Now note where we're at. We're at the same place here. Basically, we had to take this wall apart and re-engineer it. That, again, the projections outscale it. We had to go to this HESCO barrier protection. These are 4-foot tall baskets by 3-foot square that you fill with sand. And they were first implemented in a flood response on this event, and have since become sort of the standard bearer of flood wall protection around the country. They actually have the roots in the desert wars, where they use them as fortresses to build protective walls for our troops. So yeah, we went 8 feet tall with those baskets, added another 9 or another foot of sandbags would get us 9 foot. But with every day, again, we battled this for 13 days. Every day the threat kept getting bigger and bigger. Part of the problem was that all the river gauges that we were feeding our information from were not calibrated, were out of date, were not kept up. So we were getting bad information, or understated information maybe is a better way to put that on a daily basis, and trying to respond and keep up with this. So yeah, ever-increasing threats were coming in upon us. So finally, the third lesson is that, in the end, Mother Nature is going to win this battle. This is a photo taken on Thursday, June 12th, 12 days into this battle. For 12 days, we held the water back beyond the 100-year flood as it was going to a 500-year flood. This photo was taken, and to me it looks like Mother Nature sticking her finger down on us and saying, I'm tired of this. You guys are getting under my nerves. I'm going to hammer you now. And hammer she did. That night, around 8:30, the end of the earth was on us. The storms, the water, we had to shut our response and send everybody home. It was dangerous. The lightning and the water was coming down. I was going home that night, and normally take me 15 minutes to get home. It's a half an hour because of all the detours and everything. But driving through that intensity of that rain that was falling on us, I just knew that this was going to be the straw that breaks our back. So I walked into the kitchen, and after a long day, and my wife looks at me, and I just looked at her and said, we're going to lose the campus. You become that close to the event, to the water, to what's going on, the river elevation coming up. Just knew that with this rainfall, which was 55 minutes long, that was it. We were going to lose it. She started crying. She knew how much everybody at the university and facilities in particular had put into tearing walls down, building new walls up. I get a call at 3 in the morning that night saying, your shop's underwater. Our electrical distribution shop is right there. I said, oh my God, that doesn't compute. Again, knowing you get the feel for how much things are going to rise. That local rainfall, which ended up being over 3 inches of rain in 55 minutes, took over. Grabbed the utility director. We met out there before sun even rose, and this is what we started seeing start coming over the brim of our protective wall. And then by that afternoon, this is what we were dealing with. Both sides of the river came over the wall on the west side and flooded the buildings, came over the wall on the east side and flooded the tunnel system, and then came up and flooded the buildings from the bottom up. These are some of those buildings that I was pointing out, winning awards. That building actually ended up being closed longer than it had been open. I talked about the Hampshire Auditorium loss. This is that art building renovation, our museum of art. Story there about evacuating the collection, our theater building, our student union, our Frank Gehry IATO lab, it's a laser lab. High-end, very expensive equipment lost in there. That's a pedestrian bridge crossing there. This is a shot of our service building, our facilities building, the power plant, the library took on water, the English philosophy building, major classroom building took on water. This is what the tunnel system looked like afterwards. Now this is an opportunity to renew your tunnel system and get new insulation on there. This is inside that art building west, gives you some idea of how damaging that can be, delamination of auditorium seating. And these are the university's legal records, so not all was lost. Yeah, why we put legal records in a basement of a building that's along the river, I guess I'm responsible for that as much as anybody. But just amazing destruction. So, it's interesting. 55 minutes is the difference between a $20 million event and a $1 billion event. $18 million a minute. If you had a damage clock running during that final storm, that's what it would look like. 300,000 a second. It's incredible. And what's cruel, in some sense, you saw those day after flood pictures, the sun came out and we were dry, sunny for the next week or more. One rainstorm. Difference between success and failure. Now, imagine if we, for the next 2 days in that sun, we were going hog wild, putting walls up on everything, because, again, we weren't trusting any information we were getting. Imagine having that kind of event continue on for the next week. We were just getting started. So, yeah, it's just changed the course of this university, the University of Iowa, dramatically based on what is the final storm. Okay, so lesson 4 is be prepared. We do have flood emergency response plans that are now more robust. We have taken on to ourselves to remap the river to understand really what are the statistical odds of being damaged and how information that we will get upstream, how to react to that and how to model that. Use from some sophisticated tools. We re-engineered our sidewalk system. Our river sidewalks used to come up and down and dip. During the flood response, we had to shoot elevations constantly to make sure that the top of our wall was at the same elevation. After the flood, we redid our sidewalk system at a constant elevation wide enough for that HESCO barrier response so that we take some of that guesswork out of our response. That's what this wall looks like. This was what it looked like when we had to react to the same type of projected threat in 13. So in May of 13, we were doing it all over again. In fact, in 14 at APA, and somebody, I believe, attended my presentation, I talked about when lightning strikes twice. What we learned the second time around on this flood response. But before I could give that presentation, we had a 14 flood event that we went through, and so I had to cross it out and said the third time around. I gave this presentation in July of that summer of 14. We've been through this exercise 3 times, and we're still learning what works and what doesn't work. Both of those events in 13 and 14 did not top the dam, but the early projections were, watch out, this thing you could lose control over it right away. Here's some things that we have, some mitigation strategies that are coming out of the flood recovery. This is one of these invisible walls that you don't notice on the ground, but you have a 6-foot deep and a 12-foot wide foundation for these posts and panels to go in and to provide you the flood protection. This is a 12-foot wall that goes around that Art Building West that I was telling you about before. This is what the protection looked like in 14 last year. This is 3, 2, 1 stacked HESCO barriers. That, again, a lesson learned, we have contractors installed. We keep them trained. We keep them on call for this type of event. This year, we finally completed the mitigation for this building. We have a flood wall plus one of these invisible walls for this residence hall of ours. So we no longer have to do this. This was until we could get that flood mitigation effort in place. One of the things that you have when you build a flood wall is the rain comes down off the hill behind that wall. You have to get it over the wall and into the rising river. And this just shows you an example of the pumping equipment we use to pump the storm sewer over the wall. And then you see some collars here that in the lower right-hand corner, that's either a manhole or a tunnel ventilation that needs to be protected against water that would spill out in and around. So one of the things that we learned in being prepared is being in control of our own. I talked earlier how we were in competition for supplies. We have a complete warehouse of everything we need. We don't need to ask anybody for anything. It costs us a lot of money, but it gives us control of our fate. So we have all of these pumps, all of that invisible wall that I was showing you earlier. It's on tractor trailers that we own. We don't even take the time to load or line up a tractor trailer. We want to be able to respond as quickly as we can put that wall up in 2 days. Again, 6-inch, 8-inch pump inventory. Now, the problem with having this inventory is that there are folks in the state that think we've become the emergency response center for the state. We'd be more than happy to give these to anybody. Not loan them, give them. So if you guys need pumps, we'll give you one. You just have to pay us back with a new pump, because there's a lot of maintenance, and these things can go through a lot of abuse. We don't want to loan them out. We want to make sure that they're operational when we need them. The other thing is, I don't know how many of you are, show of hands, familiar with the National Incident Management System? Okay, some of you are doing this. This came out of 9/11. This is a national coordinated way to deal with a disaster, and it applies to a lot of disasters. I'll go through it quickly. But it organizes field-level operations, manages the resources, and can be applied to a number of disasters. So if you don't have that and you're doing emergency planning, You got to look at this. It's not a bad structure. It identifies key rules. Now, what was interesting in '08, we fell into most of these rules just by naturally. It just felt right that we would have incident commander would have a planning section would come up with the plan that we needed for the next day. Would have an operational group that would put it in place. We needed somebody to count keep track of all the money because of reimbursements either from insurance or FEMA. And of course, safety and information officer and other things. So this is a good system to look at if you're getting into this planning so that people know what their role is during this event. This is the thing that helped us in many ways in the '08 flood, is that we fell into these defined rules that worked rather well in a coordinated fashion. So I apologize for going through quickly, but there was a lot here. I was talking to some folks, again, I have, a dozen, 14 lessons we could have covered. But I want to end this with the fifth and final one, is to contribute to the solution as a facilities management organization. Does anybody know who these folks are? These are the presidents and chancellors who signed the American College and University President's Climate Commitment back when this was being launched in the mid part of last decade, and continues on today. There's 680 or so signatories to this, and they pledged climate neutrality by 2015. Many of us, it's actually based on peer pressure to get more and more universities to commit to this. We had a nice robust debate on our campus, as you probably had, and perhaps on your campus. And instead of aligning to that commitment, we came up with our own commitment. But the thing that didn't feel right about the President's Climate Commitment is a 50-year, well, it was 2050. It's how 40 or more years that you have to reach a goal. We wanted to bring this down to a level that, what are we going to do on our watch, administratively, institutional-wise? What are we going to do in the next 10 years? So in 2010, we put together this 2020 vision for sustainability. It was pledged by our president with the District 7, Carl Brooks, administrator for the EPA, and it laid out 7 goals that we were after. The first 4, because we put together this was sort of the thing that needed to be put together in a few months because we were just entering a new decade. The 2020 vision had a nice ring to it. This concept sprung out of the facilities management organization. So we came up with 4 measurable goals and then 3 aspirational goals maybe. They're not as measurable because they do come from the academic side of things. But this is what we were pledging that we would do in our 10 years, during our 10-year watch, which we're halfway through in this decade right now. I want to just key in on these 2 because they really are very grounded in carbon reduction and in the facilities management world. This first one, this notion of net negative energy growth, we were pledging that we were going to consume less energy in 2020 than we did 2010, despite all the growth. That we, in essence, are going to offset everything we add with reductions in the existing plant. And we're going to get there through the strength of a 2007 energy conservation plan that enabled a number of things, like sustainable design, like the requirement for commissioning and recommissioning. Funding was a major one. The funding engine is what's enabled this to happen more than anything. This funding agent lets us keep everything that we save and plow back in. So our institution says, we'll fund, though otherwise would be energy demands for the new buildings, but we're going to give it to you to keep this conservation effort going. Energy Control Center, which I know the University of Nebraska has and the University of Iowa have compared notes about our respective energy control centers. Building the organizational capacity to have the know-how, the energy engineers, the right people on the team to pursue this goal, and of course outreach and education. So very pleased that we're there so far halfway through the decade. We've offset 9 buildings or major additions so far. Over 1 million square feet has come online without adding any more demand for energy on our campus. Well, I shouldn't say it's peak demand, but not consumption demand. And the lower line, the green line, shows the actual savings or conservation efforts. The red line is the otherwise projected growth, and the delta is where we're at. We're a couple percentages below where we were in 2010, and feeling pretty good about that. We're still facing some major buildings coming online in the latter half of the decade. The work continues, but so far, this has been a success story for the University of Iowa. The other part is the renewable energy, And this is to reduce our carbon footprint. But it's also to manage costs and avoid future price increases. There's a financial interest in us diversifying our energy portfolio. There are many campuses who have gone, or either all coal or all gas or all anything. And to be all anything in this day and age, we feel, is, again, a risk that we want to manage. So we want to have different fuel sources that we can draw on, depending on events that are going on. What you're seeing in that conveyor belt is a blend of wood chips and coal being fed into what used to be just a belt full of coal going into our coal boilers. This is where we want to be. We want to take that coal usage from 50% down to 20. We want to amp up the biomass, hold natural gas, and purchase electricity pretty much. Where is that as a percentage of the total? So it's a 40% goal, and we're getting there with industrial byproducts, oat hulls. And I'll talk about in a moment, wood chips and energy grasses. And on the oat hulls, this is what we were dealing with back in '03. We had, with some modifications to our fluidized bed boiler, we were able to take a byproduct of Quaker oats, a plant that's only 20-some miles away from our campus, and burn it with coal in our boiler. And by the end of the decade, this will be a 10% strip of our total energy. When we measure total energy, it's all energy consumed on the campus. So it includes the power that we buy off campus, the natural gas that comes in, and then the fuels that are consumed on campus. So, so it would be 10% of the total, or 25% of that renewable 40% portion. The wood chips, one of the more successful things that have just come online in the last year. We're getting most of these from a pallet recycling or remanufacturing operation. It again is expected to contribute 10%. And the supply of that is almost unlimited for us. I mean, supply is not a problem with the wood chips, even from the pallet manufacturer. But if you look at the ash trees that are expected to die and other things, that's a pretty stable fuel source. Perhaps the most exciting one, though, is miscanthus. This is getting into an energy crop. We have pioneered this with a lot of partners, including Iowa State, John Deere, Iowa DNR, and other things, to come up with a crop that we can grow in the state of Iowa on land that would not be suited for corn, I'm sorry, and actually help contribute to some of the runoff problems that we have on our Iowa farmlands. And pleased to say that this thing's ramping up and holding a lot of promise. Miscanthus will get 12 feet tall. It's harvested in the dead of winter, so it's harvested at a time when the farmers aren't harvesting other crops they may have. We bring to that market a guaranteed consumption. We bring to that market the absorption of risk. We'll take the risk. If it's a good year, we'll have more. If it's a bad year, we're the perfect partner for a farmer. They basically can count on not having the risk of the weather, having a steady income, contracted income for that, and we benefit from having a reliable, renewable source of energy. And we're getting tremendous interest in this from the farming community. So we're very excited about this because we're in the farming business. The University of Iowa is not used to being in the farming business. Iowa State is, but it's a great partnership. So I just want to wrap up. These are the 5 things I'd leave you with. Again, broaden that context in the way you think about emergency planning. Take that disaster that you're thinking about and supersize it, because they're becoming supersized over time. Remember, Mother Nature always wins. One of the lessons I teach about is plan for failure, plan for losing the battle. We didn't plan for losing the battle on our campus. I could speak to that for several minutes about how that harmed us. We didn't know when to close the campus. We waited too long to close the campus down. It became a really big challenge for us, trying to hang on. Of course, be prepared, and finally contribute to the solution. And I think it ties in with Professor Wilhite's comments. We went through a branding exercise on our sustainability program on our campus, where we really dig into why are we doing the things we're doing. Now, we're doing the things in sustainability operationally for many reasons that everybody else does, the private sector, as an example. In our community, we have Procter & Gamble, ACT testing, and all that. They're sustainable as a good corporate citizen as we are. But what makes us special is that we have this ability to influence the minds of future leaders. And that is really what universities can be. That can be their brand when it comes to sustainability. And we as facilities managers, our role in this is to demonstrate what can be done. For the academic, let's call it the academic side of the house, to show these students and to influence these students thinking about what can be done. So that's where we feel very connected to the sustainability effort through Miscanthus, through Ode Halls, through energy conservation, or whatever we do. We're demonstrating, we're walking the walk for the institution, for the classroom teaching that's going on. They can point to the university as an example of possibilities of what can be done in our world. So with that, I know it's a lot. I hit you with a lot here, but hopefully I've stimulated some conversation to follow in the work group. So thank you very much. Chris.